All right, welcome everyone. This is the meeting of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission on February 8th, 2024. I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I will ask our director, Nate Wrights, to take the roll.
Roll call. Larkin?
Present.
Larkin present. Crutchfield?
Here.
Crutchfield present. Fraze?
Here.
Fraze present. Knutson?
Here.
Knutson present. Ladd?
Here.
Ladd present. Middlebrook?
Here.
Middlebrook present. Moore? Moore absent. Morath?
Present.
Morath present. Moran?
Here.
Moran present. Mueller?
Present.
Mueller present. Reeves? Reeves absent. Saxena?
Present.
Saxena present. Chair Mitchell?
Here.
Chair Mitchell present. Madam Chair, there are 11 members present, 2 members absent.
All right, with that, we have a quorum. So we'll move on to the agenda. The first item is approval of the draft meeting agenda. So I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
Commissioner Middlebrook makes the motion. Commissioner Ladd seconds. Any discussion on the agenda? Hearing none, we'll take the vote.
To the Middlebrook motion to adopt the meeting agenda, Larkin?
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Crutchfield?
Aye.
Crutchfield, yes. Fraze?
Aye.
Fraze, yes. Knutson?
Aye.
Knutson, yes. Ladd?
Yes.
Ladd, yes. Middlebrook?
Yes.
Middlebrook, yes. Moore? Moore absent. Morath?
Yes.
Morath, yes. Moran?
Yes.
Moran, yes. Mueller?
Aye.
Mueller, yes. Reeves? Reeves absent. Saxena?
Yes.
Saxena, yes. Chair Mitchell?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 11 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
With that, the motion is approved unanimously. Not unanimously. The motion is approved, sorry.
Oh, I think it
First
is
time,
unanimous. It is unanimous.
Is it unanimous?
Yeah, there's no
Oh,
dissent.
everybody here voted yes. That's right. Sorry, I was like thinking 11 out of 13. Okay. Item 3 is approval of the draft meeting minutes from January 11th, 2024. You should have all received them about a week ago. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Oh, wait, who said it first? Someone over here said it first. Was that you, Maura? No.
Middlebrook.
Middlebrook?
I said-
Okay, Commissioner Middlebrook said, made the motion, and then Commissioner Larkin seconded, right? Any discussion on the minutes? All right, hearing none, we'll go ahead and vote on that.
To the Middlebrook motion to approve the January meeting minutes, Larkin?
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Crutchfield?
Aye.
Crutchfield, yes. Fraze?
Here.
Fraze, yes. Knutson?
Yes.
Knutson, yes. Ladd?
Yes.
Yes. Middlebrook?
Yes.
Middlebrook, yes. To the Middlebrook motion to approve the January meeting minutes, Moore?
Yes.
Moore, yes. Morath?
Yes.
Morath, yes. Moran?
Yes.
Moran, yes. Mueller?
Yes.
Mueller, yes. Reeves? Reeves absent. Saxena?
Yes.
Saxena, yes. Chair Mitchell?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 12 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
With that, the motion is approved unanimously, and we'll recognize that Commissioner Moore is present now.
Thank you.
All right. Item 4 on the agenda is comprehensive review of the sentencing guidelines, the principles. So last time we went through, I'm going to pull it up for myself. We went through the objectives and principles for the comprehensive review that Matt helped us put together after some facilitation. We already approved the objectives last time around. We had some proposed changes to the principles. So on our document, those are marked in crossed out. The words that are removed are crossed out, and the words to replace that are added in. So there just some minor changes, so I thought we could circle back and see if those changes met with the approval of the commission, and if so, I would entertain a motion to approve the principles. Discussion or a motion? Looking for either one.
Would it be move approval?
That would be appropriate. Okay.
I just want to get the wording right. You got it. I would move approval, Madam Chair.
All right, for approval of the principles as revised. We already did the objectives part of the document. We just haven't done the principles. Okay, so we have a motion. Commissioner Crutchfield moves to approve the principles as revised. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Moore seconds. Any discussion? Well, hearing none.
I thought we had a second. A second.
We did. We have a second.
Oh, what were you looking at?
Discussion.
Discussion. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I think we can go ahead and vote on that.
To the Crutchfield motion to approve the comprehensive review principles as revised. Larkin?
Yes.
Larkin, yes. Crutchfield?
Aye.
Crutchfield, yes. Fraze?
Yes.
Fraze, yes. Knutson?
Yes.
Knutson, yes. Ladd?
Yes.
Ladd, yes. Middlebrook?
Yes.
Middlebrook, yes. Moore?
Yes.
Moore, yes. Morath?
Yes.
Morath, yes. Moran?
Yes.
Moran, yes. Mueller?
Yes.
Mueller, yes. Reeves? Reeves, absent. Saxena?
Yes.
Saxena, yes. Chair Mitchell?
Yes.
Chair Mitchell, yes. Madam Chair, there are 12 votes in favor, no votes opposed.
And with that, the motion is approved unanimously. All right, thank you. Next item on the agenda, I have to pull it up. Next item on the agenda is a comprehensive review, public engagement planning. So I will turn this over to,
Did you want to discuss the clouds at all?
oh, I wasn't going to do that now.
Okay, that's
Maybe that's the next one, sorry. But thanks for the reminder. Yeah, public engagement planning. So we'll turn it over to Charlie or Shamsa. I'm not sure which one of you is taking.
To me first, Madam Chair.
Okay. Go for it.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And because we're joining you virtually today, please interrupt me, Madam Chair, or others if I can't kind of tell if you're trying to ask a question visually. But glad to be with you again. So I'll share some slide content. Are you all able to see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. And let me know too if I'm talking too softly or quickly or loudly or anything else. Yeah, we're glad to be back today to talk about the planning where we are for public engagement. So I'll be talking through some of the initial questions we have around the topics and get your direction there. And then my colleague Shamsa will be talking about the audiences that will be engaging in the coming months. As just a regrounding, here are the implications that we had heard and observed from our discussion that we had had with you on the principles and objectives. These are some of the things that we're carrying forward into our engagement planning. So this is a slide you've seen before, but just wanted to bring us back to where we've been and kind of what we've already talked about in this space. What's new that I wanted to share today in more detail, at least, is our sense of timeline for the engagement work over the coming year. So we are now in this planning and design phase where we've started to identify events and organizations, and Shamsa will talk through that more in a few minutes. We're designing methods for engagement and developing materials, but we're still in the middle of that phase, and today want your feedback and direction on that, and we'll return in March with a more final plan for that And in March, we'll also then shift after the March commission meeting to doing actual engagement activities for the end of the state fiscal year. So through June, we'll be hosting up to 30 different engagement sessions and activities around the state. We'll be trying to join existing events where we can to meet people where they are and ideally get a cross-section of people coming from around the state. But we know that we'll also need to create many new events to fill in gaps in who we're trying to hear from and where we're trying to hear from them. We may also program and administer a survey so that people who we reach out to but aren't able to attend one of our events are able to provide feedback in a written format. And then over the summer is when we'll be doing our initial synthesis. So that's where we'll be thinking about what are we hearing and learning from the different groups that we've heard from over the past few months at that point. And we'll also confer with staff and with the research side of the work to talk about what we're learning collectively. And then the plan would be to come back in September to this body to share our findings with you and get your feedback on what you think is missing in terms of the people that we've been able to reach and what we've heard, and design some follow-up activities for the late fall and winter. So that could be follow-up listening sessions, focus groups, a broader survey, or other activities based on your input and direction. So we kind of have two windows for engagement, this larger one that's coming soon, and then a subsequent one later in the calendar year after you've gotten some initial findings from us. And then we'd be writing a final report early next year that documented the process and the findings that we had. Because I can't really see you all very well, I'll just pause and see if there's any immediate questions on the timeline.
Any questions from commission members? I am not seeing any, Charlie.
Okay, thank you. So I will then turn to our first main topic of this segment, which is wanting to get your input on the topics that we are going to be learning about. And so the way that we think of these is sort of as research questions, but I put that in quotes because we're not research in the same way that the other work being conducted is, but instead, obviously we're doing engagement work, yet we are still sort of asking ourselves these high-level questions, and we want to see if these are on the right track. So these are not necessarily things that we are literally going to ask in a session. They could be, but for example, if we do a focus group, it might be a more conversational format where we're building towards some of these topics. So don't see these again as literal questions we'd be asking. We might, but these are more topics or research questions that we're trying to answer in our engagement work. And so we've divided them into two halves. The first half is with people who have direct familiarity with the sentencing guidelines. What are we trying to learn and understand from them? So based on our conversation so far, we think there are kind of implied topics or questions from our work so far. And those are what are working well with the current guidelines and what are the challenges? And within the challenges, are there provisions that are confusing or have different interpretations? And what suggestions people have as a result for improvement? On the side of people without as direct familiarity with the sentencing guidelines, we had more broad questions that we saw as implied. So the first was, what characteristics or features would make sentencing more fair and just? And what characteristics or features would make sentencing more understandable to practitioners and to the public? So there's a lot here to digest. So I do want to engage the commission in a conversation on these. So I'll pose a question to you, and then I'll come back to this slide so you can review our kind of early draft here. So the question I want to ask you all now here, are these the topics, the right sort of research questions that we should be exploring? Another way of thinking about this, it's the same question just stated very differently, is what do you need to know as a body and as individuals from practitioners and the public to guide your decision making? So when you imagine making changes to the sentencing guidelines, what input from the public, from practitioners, will help you make better decisions, will help you guide your decision making, and are these topics the right direction to go in order to inform you in the work that you're doing ahead of you. So I'll turn back to the topics that we have so far, and Chair Mitchell, if you would be willing, we would kind of let you kind of see who might want to speak and give input here, but kind of want to open it up to discussion.
Yeah, discussion on the questions. Are they hitting the mark? What feedback do you have for our consultants here? Commissioner Fraze?
I guess the question of what, as I understood it, of what results would be especially valuable to us to guide our decision making. One of them is, and I'm not sure I saw it in the phrasing here, but it may be implicit. What things does the public not correctly understand about the guidelines? I imagine that there's a fair amount of misunderstanding or just not knowing. And I guess that relates to a sort of a procedural question back to the timeline here. I guess the earliest consultation back with the commission is with commission staff in July and August. So I guess that will be an occasion to find out whether there is a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding, lack of information, because that will be more apparent to people on the commission staff and members than it is to the people conducting these events.
Charlie, do you want to respond to that? Any either of those things?
Yeah, I mean, just on the timeline point, right? So we are imagining sort of that summer period to be able to bring back early findings, and then do follow up as useful and as needed. I think it's a great question, and it's a good example of sort of a more research question and a question we would ask people directly, right? But of understanding where are the gaps in awareness of how things work or what the current status quo is. I would be curious to know, are you asking kind of broadly about the sentencing system, or specifically about, you know, individual the elements of the grid, for example? Like what are we trying to assess when it comes to understanding and what would be useful to you to know, right? Like, is it this, you know, this type of offenses is people don't understand, or what type of information would be most useful to the commission?
Commissioner
Well, I
Fraze?
guess part of the problem is we've never done this before. So we can only speculate about what lack of information and misinformation is out there. I certainly, even within the more select group of people who pay attention to sentencing rules, there's a lot of misunderstanding of the nature of guidelines. They're sometimes described as mandatory rules, at least if they're enforceable by appeal. They are not mandatory in the sense that a mandatory minimum statute is. I think there's probably widespread perception based on high-profile cases that people never get held accountable for this crime or that crime. But again, it's that we've never done this before, at least to my knowledge. If we get any feedback at all from the people outside of this body, it's sort of anecdotal. People who show up at meetings who, you know, have a particular view.
And I'll just piggyback on that, and then Commissioner Larkin, I'll call on you. I'll piggyback on that, you know, it might be, if we can work it in, it might be interesting to know the public's understanding of how the guidelines, do they understand how they work and how they affect sentences? Because what will typically happen with a high profile case is the media will say this offense is punishable by up to 25 years, but that's not what the guidelines call for, right? So, you know, it'd be interesting to know to what extent the public understands how the guidelines play a role in sentencing. If that's even possible to get at. I don't know.
No, it's a good
Commissioner
question.
Larkin. Oh, go ahead.
My question back to you, I mean, no answer needed now, but is how would you use that information? Because that will help us determine how we will gather it or in what detail and in what format. Because, yeah, how would that shape your decision making if you knew, for example, there were certain pieces where there was a lot of confusion or misunderstanding? But no immediate answer needed there, just something to think about.
Yeah. I was thinking the same thing as you were saying it there, as Commissioner Fraze was raising it. How would we use that? Okay, that's an excellent question. Commissioner Larkin, and then Commissioner Crutchfield.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good job. I like where this is starting. One thing I thought was perhaps there's a way to ask, are there certain offenses for which you think, prison is unnecessary, probation is appropriate? Are there certain offenses where you think absolutely this person should go to prison? Because I mean, it seems like at the end of the day, the majority of what we do is rank offenses. So it seems like this would be a nice opportunity to gain information that would enable us to consider whether or not our current rankings are appropriate or they need some adjustment based on what the public is looking for. I mean, I'm sure there are many offenses where the public would say, well, why would we put someone in prison for that? But on the other hand, why aren't we doing it over here? So, and maybe that could be a general question.
So the severity rankings, that's helpful.
But I think she's saying that you can ask it more broadly because they don't need to have the specific knowledge about severity, but it helps us where we place things on the grid determines whether prison is even an option. So if we knew sort of generally from people that they felt like there were offenses that should or shouldn't receive prison, that would be input into our process.
It's helpful. Thanks.
Commissioner Larkin, do you want to follow up to that?
Just an observation that the guidelines are so specialized. I don't know how much value there is in knowing what the public doesn't know about them. The public knows next to nothing about them. And I don't know how much information we're going to gauge to measure their lack of understanding. I think we can go into this knowing that the majority of the public doesn't know what the guidelines are or how they work. And therefore, when we do these types of questions to the people who aren't familiar with them, they have to be very broad, as the chair just pointed out. I mean, we can't ask, well, what do you think of these rankings? It's just broadly, what are you expecting from the criminal justice system in terms of what happens to people who commit crimes? Are there different crimes that are more of a concern, such that you think, prison's appropriate? Why do you think that? Just generally those types of questions, as opposed to the workings of the guidelines or any sort of technical aspect of it. Of course, those questions would be appropriate for the first group. And one question I have is, and this might be ahead of ourselves, in terms of soliciting this information, can we make suggestions? I mean, for example, is there a way that we can just distribute these questions to all of the district court judges, all of the probation officers? I would bet that the district court judges would respond in writing to solicited feedback. They generally are good about doing that. I don't know, maybe.
No, absolutely.
Thanks. I'm wrong.
Yeah, so Shamsa will talk in a few minutes about the audiences, and I'll talk a little bit about formats. I think we had imagined most of the survey type work we would do in that second wave, just because in our general experience, surveys are better once you know a little bit more about the topic and what people already are wondering about, and you can then quantify it. But if there's a group like judges where written input is actually the best format to engage them over trying to invite them to a in-person event, for example, that could be something we do even earlier on. So that's helpful feedback for Shamsa in her segment a little bit later.
Okay, we have a question we have input from Commissioner Crutchfield, and then after that, we'll go to Commissioner Moran.
So I hate to be very obtuse and very granular, but on the granular side, I think that the idea of truth in sentencing, in other words, I think there's confusion amongst the general public if someone is what a determinate sentence versus, you know, the old indeterminate sentencing. And if you're given 48 months, they think, well, then you're out in 7 months. Or they don't know, you know, they hear a sentence, but then they know there's some lesser sentence that a person actually serves. And I think there's confusion around that. And I don't know if that plays in. The other issue would be kind of on the other end of the spectrum is just if people understand what the purpose of incarceration is and if we're getting towards those purposes.
Commissioner Moran.
Yeah, I just, the only thing I have to offer on this subject is the aspect of the individual that was on the other side and what I dealt with when I was 20 years ago now, but 18 years old. And you guys are hitting the nail on the head. All I thought about at 18 years old was I saw the big number and the little number when I went through this myself. And I didn't know what fell in between. I didn't have anybody to help me except my attorney. And, you know, they tried to do the best they could. So I really think that you guys are hitting the nail on the head with this, with being able to nail down and how to have the general public understand. And this is, you know, somebody I had everything invested into this when I was 18 years old. This was my life. I thought it was over. And so, you know, I think, you know, the better understanding for the public and better education for the public of understanding why things have, or how the Sentencing Guideline Commission works would be extremely beneficial.
Commissioner Mueller.
Yeah, I agree with all the comments, and I would also agree that the general public has no idea. And so I don't know if it's worthwhile or not, but is there like I'm just looking at the grid, is there a way to navigate or develop some sort of a worksheet where someone could, like we could identify how people currently feel about, you know, the offenses and the criminal history score and how that matches up. And I mean, I don't necessarily saying give them the grid and say, what do you think of this? Because they might go, oh my gosh, I don't understand that. But maybe there's some way to gauge, you know, what we currently have and what their thoughts are about that, or other crimes where they should fit, or something like that. Just like a tangible, here's what the sentencing guidelines are, you know, and to, for lack of a better phrase, dumb that down for someone who doesn't spend time in that, to get some information that way.
Any other input from commission members? I'm not seeing anything else, and everyone has said everything I thought of, so I have nothing else.
Okay, well, that's really helpful input and direction. And we've been taking notes, and we'll come back in March with some ideas or more concrete plans based on all of this input. I did want to give you a preview of some of the formats we're thinking about. We will revise this plan based on what you all just said. But just to give you a preview of where we're starting to go is we're imagining, based on these levels of familiarity, we'd have sort of different formats. So for people who have more direct familiarity with the guidelines because they are working in the system, not just in the criminal justice system broadly, but in a role where they do have some exposure to the guidelines, we were imagining more of a listening session format in the sense that people's comments might not be connected to one another. Instead, they may come with feedback they're intending to give us, and we want to let them do that and not overly structure it for them, but let the comments be separate from one another, be more open-ended. They could be in a mix of medium or large size groups, whereas for people without direct familiarity with the sentencing guidelines, and this could be members of the public or it could be certain groups of practitioners, we were imagining a format that was more of a focus group format where it would be conversational and comments with the group would build on each other's comments rather than being disconnected in that more listening session format. So we would try to build questions to build a conversation towards these topics that we're talking about, with a mix of sizes that would probably be a little bit smaller to enable that more conversational format. And we're also thinking about a mix of formats within a session to capture both verbal feedback and kind of written feedback people would provide at the beginning and end to capture some of that more granular input and feedback. So again, we're going to come back in March with a more detailed version of this based on the conversation today. But I will pause and see if there's any kind of immediate questions or feedback on where we're going in terms of the formats.
Comments from the commission? Okay, everyone's being really quiet today. What I will say, I want to just punctuate the comment that Judge Larkin made earlier. I do think that there will be some people who will just, you know, be able to say right away what they think we should change in the first group. So the people that are familiar with the guidelines. So I do think, like, if you asked a judge, they would probably just rattle off the 3 things that need to be fixed. So she might be right that that trying to do a little bit of maybe open-ended-ish survey, free answer written, something where we would send it to everybody, might actually get us some pretty quick feedback from the practitioners about what they think we should work on, and maybe you couple that with some, you know, a few listening sessions. But I think people have some strong opinions about the guidelines. I don't know. Did you want to say something?
Well, yes, I mean, I think you will get that very technical, field-specific feedback from practitioners, judges, probation agents, people that work in the system and have their experience with things either working or not working. And then I think you're going to have what Commissioner Crutchfield was talking about. You're going to have some of these broader sort of philosophical policy questions and just fundamental questions about how sentencing works in the state of Minnesota. Why do people serve 2/3 of their sentence? What does supervised release mean? These sorts of things that are more maybe general in knowledge. And I think having engagement formats that allow input from both of those segments, I think, is really important to get a comprehensive look at people's thoughts about sentencing.
Yeah. Commissioner Morath and then Commissioner Middlebrook.
I was just going to say, even with the second group that will have likely a less technical understanding, I think we can still get at more nuanced concepts by just asking the right probing questions. Just asking a simple, are you more for punitive or restorative justice? Like, sure, but even using things like hypothetical scenarios. Okay, if data were to reveal that a certain approach led to increased public safety, would you perhaps consider a different view? And I think it's just asking those simple probing questions can break through those really black and white philosophical boxes. So,
Commissioner Middlebrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, just to build a little bit on what Commissioner Morath said, with the first group, I think we're going to get some real strong opinions and suggestions and comments about how things work well and don't work well. My question, I guess, for the second group is, with these sessions, like these focus groups, we may need to do a little bit of educating. Because there may be, like what's been brought up, that we can ask the general questions, but there's not going to be a lot of familiarity with how the guidelines work and maybe even some, misconceptions about that. So I'm kind of curious if we might have to do some kind of a broader education piece on those. I don't know what Charlie thinks about that.
Yeah, I think we have to design the format still a lot. And I think it goes back to these topics of, the topics that are on this bottom half here. I think you could ask without explicitly referencing the current guidelines. But I think there is a piece of some of the other things you've raised today as a group where we might want to have a section of that conversation where we do share a little bit of the current state and get their reaction and feedback. I think we'll have to think about how much of that we can share, whether we're kind of zeroing in on some examples or sharing a variety of different things or doing different things in different sessions so we get feedback on a range of different topics. So we have some thinking to do about how to do that logistically, but I do think that in that second, on this bottom half of the screen for the not having direct familiarity with the guidelines group, there is a space for potentially sharing some current state information and getting reaction to it for sure.
Commissioner Ladd and then Commissioner Crutchfield.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to piggyback on what Commissioner Middlebrook has said related to that second group. I think there's, in a second group, I think we really need to focus on that group understanding what the guidelines do versus what the law does. Because what I hear a lot in my practice is people hear these maximum sentences for these offenses. And then if they prosecutors or judges or somebody are giving these cases away because somebody gets 30 days in jail and probation, and it's like, well, it's a 10 years in prison and, something fine. And so I don't want to have an unrealistic expectation of what we're doing versus what the law is. And so if we're gonna glean information, there has to be some education so that there isn't a walk away from that where they're either frustrated like we didn't listen or that it didn't address what their issues were, because some of that is not going to be our lane. And I think we have to be very, in that education process, recognizing that if somebody doesn't like what the law is related to, like maximum sentences, but this is how it works with criminal history and the guidelines, that's different than what maximum sentences are. And I think lay people generally don't understand that. And so explaining that so that the information that we're getting from them is not predicated on things that we don't control and that we don't have any responsibility over, I think is really important, because otherwise their information is not going to particularly be helpful if their focus is how come somebody gets charged with this, but they get probation or they only get this much, but yet the penalty is this. We can explain that, but that we don't set those. That's a legislative piece. And so I think that's really important in that questioning, in that format, because we're not going to get a lot of good information if they don't understand that as an outset of sort of what our roles and responsibilities are versus what the legislature is.
Commissioner Crutchfield.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And building on that, I think it's a question about public safety. I think it's a question for the public about, the sentences is one key element. It's only one. There are all sorts of other elements, but how does this relate to the safety of Minnesotans? And are we getting there with these sentences? And that's a deep topic, but I mean, that's in my mind kind of what's at the base of all
this. Madam Chair, was there other discussion? If not, I will hand it over to Shamsa to talk about the audiences for engagement, which I think is a good link to this conversation of who are we hearing from, how are we reaching them. So Shamsa, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. So now that Charlie outlined potential formats for engagement, I want us to shift our focus to the key audiences we aim to engage with. In this next slide, we'll dive into the various regions and audience that we'll be targeting within our outreach efforts. So we want to make sure or ensure that our engagement efforts are inclusive and representative of Minnesota's diverse population. And in order to achieve this, we structured our approach to reach Minnesotans across various regions and identities. With the help of MSG staff, we decided to group together judicial districts into regions for engagement purposes, committing to at least one in-person event and at least one online event focused on each region. And in order to explain our methodology, we kind of basically group together broadly based on the shared characteristics, and we are aware of the distinct culture inputs within the districts. So we have District 2 and 4 that will be grouped together. This would be Ramsey and Hennepin. District 1 and 10 will be grouped together. This is the outer ring suburban metro area. District 3, 5, and 8 will be grouped together. So this will be the south and southwest of Minnesota. And then we will have District 7 and 9 grouped together, where majority of the tribal nations reside in, and this would be Northwest Minnesota. And then lastly, District 6, which is Northeast Minnesota, which has a couple of tribal nations residing there as well. Next slide, please. So we shared a version of this before in our previous presentation and made edits based on the feedback that we received from the MSG staff and then as well as commissioners. As you can note here, we separated probation officers from the treatment and rehabilitative service providers. And for each category, we're making sure that we contact professional and advocacy organizations, as well as other key informants. We're making sure that we also reach communities experiencing sentencing disparities, and then also ensuring that we reach individuals across different geographic regions, which I explained in the previous slide. Next slide, please. As you see here, these are the examples of organizations and associations. The highlighted ones are known events that we found or meetings that we were able to find on their website. And the ones with asterisks are those with limited information regarding the existing meetings they have scheduled. For example, we found that Minnesota Correctional Association, MCA, has one monthly workshop scheduled on their website, which is the ethical issues in case management and counseling, but that workshop is scheduled in February 16, which kind of conflicts with our engagement schedule, where we are deciding where we're going to be doing our engagement process between the months of March, April, May, and June. And another example would be like the Criminal Law Committee with the Minnesota State Bar Association. They had a meeting on January 30th, which passed, but they don't have any other meetings that are scheduled on their website. We also want to make a note that these example organizations or events may not be interested in hosting sessions with us, but nonetheless, we recommend reaching out to them first before hosting our own events. Next slide, please. And then, so this will be, this slide are example organizations within the category of the people with lived experience interacting with the criminal justice system, and then also people without direct interaction with the criminal justice system. So the question I want to pose for you all today, if you can go to the next slide, please, Charlie, is as we're considering, your extensive connections within your respective practitioner groups or the broader public, we would appreciate your input on what organizations or events within your professional network do you believe would be instrumental in co-hosting events? And then also drawing on your experience, can you suggest key contacts or channels that we should explore within your practitioner community to ensure that we have a comprehensive and inclusive outreach effort? And if you were to consider this from like a perspective of a judge, are there specific events or tactical strategies that could facilitate input from a diverse range of judicial perspectives? And I made note that, making sure maybe providing a written opportunity for these judges or other practitioners would be really efficient. And then also we had some individuals or some commissioners bring up the fact that, we may need to provide education and educating the second group of individuals and offering them a broader education piece. So we can go back to the slide 11. So as we're looking at the practitioners with work experience interaction sentencing guidelines, I want to call on, Madam Chair Kelly Lynn Mitchell, Madam Vice Chair Michelle Larkin, David Knudsen, Madam Commissioner Carrie Ladd, Commissioner Catherine Middlebrook, Commissioner Moore, Commissioner Mueller, Commissioner Crutchfield on giving me input on how we could get information or strategize how we could engage with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and legal aid providers, judges, law enforcement, correction and probation officers, release and reentry programs, treatment and rehabilitative service providers, and other professional associations. So if you could all please provide input, that would be helpful. And then as I'm not in the room right now, so I won't be able to call on those who are raising their hand or who have some input. So if Madam Chair could
I'll take
assist
care of
me with that. Yeah, thank you.
I'll take care of that. So we'll start with Commissioner Ladd has her hand up.
Commissioner Ladd does not.
Clerk.
I'm sorry. It's the other L.
Okay.
Commissioner Larkin.
Oh.
Sorry, thank you so much.
I suggest this. I know it's really difficult to expect district court judges to have time to go in an in-person session. There might be value in doing just a blast email to all the judges with the survey. And then as part of it saying, would you be willing to be part of a listening group or a conversation group online at a scheduled time? And I bet you're going to get a decent amount of people who say, yes, they'll be willing to do that online. Again, I could be wrong, but that's my sense.
If I could respond to that. So a question I would have is who would be responsible? Who would be the individual who will be sending out these blast emails? Would we be getting the email or contact information from the commissioners or the MSG staff, or would we be able to use commissioners or MSG staff to send out that on behalf of us?
Madam Chair, I can speak to that.
Commissioner.
So the judicial branch is very protective of the judges' email addresses. They will not release any email addresses. So you'd have to coordinate with Jeff Shorba, the state court administrator or someone in his office and get their cooperation, and they would have to agree to send out the email blast, which they may very well be willing to do.
And then I would just ask our judicial members to also advocate for us with Jeff on that front.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Knudsen.
what's the time frame of the gathering of this information again? I got lost on that.
So I believe Charlie presented that piece, but so we'll be doing our first round of engagement from March to June. And then we'll be doing our second round of engagement. This will probably be more survey based. That would be, Charlie, can you remind me?
In the
when
fall,
second
so
round?
October
In the fall,
through
okay.
December.
Yeah.
Fall and early winter of this, not next year, but next this coming fall and late in 2024 for that second round. Which we imagine that was the more survey side of the thing, but as you're saying, if there are groups like judges where written feedback is going to be the right format even from the beginning, we could certainly do that on the front end in this initial March through June window as well.
Because the judges have two conferences in the fall. At the end of September is the Minnesota District Judges Association, and that's up in Brainerd. And oftentimes there's breakout sessions. We could solicit feedback and discussion and whatnot in coordination with the District Judges Association or with State Court Administration, which would be the first week of December, and that would be at the Radisson Blu in Bloomington. So you've got those two opportunities, lots of different breakout sessions, that kind of thing, where there might be an opportunity for us to convene or solicit in-person feedback at one or both of those conferences. Sound like a good idea? Is that possible?
I mean, are we able to, as non-judges, are we able to attend those meetings would be a question I have.
Yes, we have outsiders attend all the time that present, that provide us information, that do all kinds of things to further our mission.
I think, Sam, so since we have members on this group that represent all of these different organizations, I think each of the members can provide additional information that we don't necessarily have to go through at the meeting today about how to connect in with these different organizations and different different methods along those lines. But, I think that Commissioner Knudsen is suggesting that you would probably work with the organizers to create a session for one of those conferences, one or both of those conferences. And that's how you would be attending. I assume Commissioner Ladd might be able to facilitate some input from the County Attorneys Association. Am I right with that?
Yes, you are. And I think that, our executive director we meet weekly, actually, all 87 county attorneys. And then we have our board meetings monthly. We also have a criminal law committee that's co-chaired by Meeker County and Dakota County attorneys. And a lot of our stuff that we do as an organization gets vetted through that group. So I don't think you're gonna have a shortage of county attorneys that are gonna raise their hand. But I think my concern would be is to make sure that we would get a broad spectrum. We wouldn't just get metro or we wouldn't just get rural, that we would get a balance of practitioners from across the state to sort of give some voice to this. So, but no problem at all from our organization, for sure.
And I'm just gonna keep going around there. Commissioner Middlebrook, I assume that you could help with public defenders.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was just thinking through, most of the districts have a quarterly meeting that would probably fall in this initial timeframe. The MACDL, as a member, I'm on a listserv for that, and I know several of the people on the board that I could probably figure out something with that. I don't know, using the listserv might be too much, but I've got some connections there I can try to figure out with that group as well.
Okay. Commissioner Mueller, law enforcement, what are your suggestions there?
Yeah, for sure. Just for clarification, the jail programs and services falls under the Sheriff's Association. So it's a different group. It's the jail programmers or the jail administrators. But just really connecting with the Chiefs Police Association, I'm on that board, and the Sheriff's Association. I would just connect you with the executive directors of both of those and be able to navigate how best to facilitate this.
Okay. Our probation officer rep is not here today, but you have the right associations listed for the probation folks. So, and also as at DOC, I work over that area, so I can certainly help connect you with those organizations, but I do think they're the right ones to, whether you're seeing off of events they have or whether they're helping you get communications out to people to recruit for events or for a survey, those are the right organizations to help with that. What else do we have on here? Legal aid. Oh, I don't know. It's not my thing. I don't know if we have anyone who has connections there.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Yes.
So I see that social workers are listed on here, and my question I had about that was if we were talking in the sense of traditional social workers, or we're talking about a lot of counties now have social workers that are embedded in their jails and their correctional system. If we were focused on that sort of subcategory of social workers, or what the idea was or the thought was with the social worker component. So more maybe a point of clarification, or because I do think that I think that those are some important folks, but I just didn't know like how broad that is or who we were looking at.
So we actually had that discussion, Charlie and I, earlier before this meeting, and unfortunately, you weren't able to remove that before the meeting. But yes, we are making sure that we connect with those who are with. We do know that social workers are embedded within different organizations, like such as like the probation officers and like and treatment rehabilitative service providers. So reaching out to social workers within those organizations and entities instead of the broad general social workers.
That's kind of a question for you too, right? Like,
yeah.
Unless you think we should be reaching out to like a broad social work association, we just weren't sure whether that would be whether that group would have the interactions or familiarity to give useful feedback. but originally these were grouped a little bit differently, and so this was kind of a leftover of that. So it might be a question back to the group as well.
Okay. Commissioner Saxena?
Thank you. I was just going to respond to your question about legal aid providers. I could get you in touch with the right people for the Innocence Project, the Neighborhood Justice Center, Children's Law Center. And I don't think I know anyone at the others.
Great. I was also going to say I can assist with reentry. So I think what it comes down to is you might have to reach out to individual members on the commission, and then we can help connect you to specific places if that would work for you all. But it sounds like we all have some connections that we can help facilitate to get you to the right places.
That would be really helpful. So we'll be reaching out to individual commissioners to get more input on how we can get connected to these organizations and associations. All right, next slide, please, Charlie. All right, so, I mean, this slide is people with lived experience interacting in the criminal justice system, and then also people without direct interaction with the criminal justice system. And so I haven't mentioned the missing commissioners that I have not heard from were Commissioner Tim Moran, Commissioner Brooke Morath, and Commissioner Saxena, who did give some feedback on how we could reach out to the legal aid providers. We also could probably get some feedback on your input on these two categories, and then also Commissioner Fraze as well too. So if you have any ideas of how we could connect with these organizations, you can let us know now, and then we'll also reach out to you guys at the end to get more feedback.
Commissioner Morath.
I would definitely add for the victim advocacy group, the Minnesota Alliance on Crime. That is a coalition of different victim service organizations across the state, broad representation, and we'll definitely have more of a working understanding and firsthand knowledge of the sentencing guidelines, which will be very helpful in this group. And I know that they have monthly meetings, and I believe they meet in the Afton room here, so they're pretty easy to find. And one of the board members is already aware of the comprehensive review that we're doing, so can easily get you in contact with them.
Commissioner Saxena has his hand up.
Thank you. I was going to ask that you consider adding children of incarcerated caregivers on the first category. They do a lot with obviously families. That for your second major bullet there, that might be a good organization. And then on the people without direct interactions, I don't see the Minnesota Urban League listed. The Urban League might be another good organization to reach out to on that.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Moran has his hand up, and then we'll go to Commissioner Crutchfield.
Yeah, I think you're kind of already heading in this direction, but I as far as the people who are incarcerated, I would say working through their attorneys. There's a trust level between the two of them. Not to mention also there's a communication level that they know how to explain things a little different and on the level that they need to be communicated with. So I'd say that, but also then working with the DOC and the fact that each incarcerated individual has a caseworker, and sometimes they create a trustworthy bond with those individuals, and sometimes they don't, but it's another avenue to get the information from that group of individuals.
Commissioner Crutchfield?
I was just gonna say that the Urban League is an excellent idea, and that please contact me because there are a host of other agencies like the Urban League that work with formerly, my organization, several others, works with formerly incarcerated people, and I'm more than willing to help facilitate focus group or meetings or whatever we have to do.
Thank you. That leads me to,
Commissioner Knudsen has a comment or question too.
yes, go ahead.
I was thinking more along the lines of more general public interest type of organizations. We've really kind of found the specialization, people that actually have special interests and special connection with the guidelines or with the criminal justice system, but broad-based public policy people that have an interest in crime and its effect on our communities. We need to reach out to those folks. And I would suggest several. Number one, the other MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I don't know that they're on our list. I would suggest the Minnesota Retailers Association. I would suggest the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, just as a kind of a start of people, general interest type public concerned organizations that specifically throughout the years have had an interest in the issue of crime and crime prevention.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to give us some input on this slide?
I think Director Wright has a comment.
Yep, Madam Chair and Shamsa, I would just ask that the emails be individual to individual or maybe two or three people, but that just to avoid any group emails, and this is also for the commission members to avoid violations of the open meeting law. So.
All right, anything else you need to cover here, Shamsa, or any other input from the commission?
All right. I also would like to just add, there's a good point that Commissioner Crutchfield has brought up, which is a possible opportunity for commissioners to be a part of the engagement process. So when we reach out, we'll also be considering that within the email as well too, just for a heads up.
Great.
All right. All right, so on this page, so as an engagement strategy, we just want to reiterate that we're going to be broadly engaging communities and affinity organizations to aid in the recruiting and aiding recruiting participants for events. In addition, as well, based on the MSGC recent report to legislator, we know that the Black African American population that made up 7.1% of Minnesota's population had about 26% of those sentenced, and then the American Indian population, 1.5% of the state, which made up 9.3% of the sentence. And for that reason, we want to ensure that there are events focused on both American Indian and tribal communities, as well as the Black Minnesotan community. And with that being said, we'll also be working with the Commission to develop processes for obtaining input from tribal nations, including involving the tribal court, state court forum.
Thanks, Shamsa. And I just have one last slide about next steps. So before the March meeting, we'll be reaching out to you all again, actually, as we were just talking about, to individually follow up on suggestions you have for contacts, organizations, or formats for particular audiences. So look from that from us. We'll also then, based on that, begin outreach to individual organizations to think about their calendar and schedule. And then in the March MSGC meeting, we'll be back to present plans and share more detail on the format and kind of where we are going from there. And then after the March meeting, we'll begin actual engagement sessions. So we won't schedule anything before the next commission meeting. And then after that meeting through the end of June, we'll be hosting that first round of engagement sessions across the state, aiming to host up to 30 sessions in a mix of in-person and virtual and different topic areas and different audience groups around the state. And then, as we talked about earlier, I'll just return to this kind of timeline slide. Over the summer, we'll be doing that initial synthesis to bring back to you. Currently planning that to be in September, where we'd share what we've heard so far and get your feedback on additional follow-up engagement activities that would be occurring in that October through December window, building up to that final report in early 2025. So those are the slides that we had to present to you today, but Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you if there's any kind of final questions or comments from the commission.
All right, thanks. Any other questions before we close this one out, close this piece out? All right, well, thank you, Charlie and Shamsa for your work on this and developing out the information that you brought today. Good discussion. I'm really looking forward to getting this launched. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.
Okay, so we will move to the next item on our agenda, which is the continuing on with the comprehensive review. We have the University of Minnesota research team here, so I'll ask them to go ahead and come up to the front and I'll hand it over to you.
How do you do the PowerPoint?
To show the PowerPoint, somebody's going to have to be in the meeting. So if you want to accept the panelist invitation, but it's the only way to project it to
Okay.
the folks online and the public.
Yes, that makes sense.
And we do have coffee while folks are setting up if anybody's interested in that. Just take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, we'll just take 5 minutes so you guys can get set up. So come back at 2:13, everybody.
You don't have
So we did. We got that. So my brother and I,
We got that. Okay, we are back. And I want to welcome the team from the University of Minnesota, our research team. We're going to have them introduce themselves and then I'll let you guys just take it away and go through what you want to go through today. So who's starting?
I'm going to start and I'm going to eventually introduce everybody, but we can wait a little bit. I can go.
You can go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Leskrinsky. I'm the research director at the Robina Institute for Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. We are at the University of Minnesota Law School. I have some other people here from the University of Minnesota as well as the Upjohn Institute. So as you may remember, in October, you all voted unanimously to support our research partnership. So I'm here to kind of get that started. We'd like to get some direction, some feedback from you about what we should be doing. And so today is going to be more of a discussion where we're really here to listen and learn. So with that.
Would you mind real quick, for the record, we do have to know who all's here. So would you mind just quick going through like who's here?
Yeah, you know what? I can go forward a couple of slides.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to make that.
No. It's I was going to do this anyway, so.
Okay, so I'm Kevin Wright. I'm on the law faculty at the University of Minnesota. I presented last month, so hello again, everybody.
I'm Chris Eugen. I'm in sociology, law, and public affairs at the university, and I've also presented before this group.
I'm Aaron Sojourner. I'm a labor economist. I'm at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research and was at the Carlson School of Management for 13 years.
And I will briefly introduce Nick Dickens is here with us, who is a graduate student in sociology, research assistant, and also a master's in statistics.
So at some point last year, Arnold Ventures, who's a large philanthropy that kind of does a lot of work in this area, reached out to the Robina Institute because they had funded 2 prior research partnerships between commissions and universities. And so they were looking to fund a 3rd partnership because they really do value research. They think that policies are best made when research informs them. So obviously we were interested because we had a prior relationship with the commission, and we knew the commission was undertaking a comprehensive review. And so really the goal of the research project is to support the commission as they undertake the comprehensive review, so to support you all. So you voted to approve this partnership in October, and we did win that award. So we have some money to do that work over the course of the next 2 years. This started last month. It's going to end at the end of 2025. So that's why we're here. We'd like to get started on some of the questions that you all need answers. The research process is long. We'd like to start kind of figuring out what topics we want to zero in on. We'd like to start asking people for data. We'd like to start getting IRB approvals, just trying to get our research methods in order. So really today, like I said, I want to provide an overview of the research partnership. I'd like to present a menu of ideas to you for possible consideration. And really, we're here to listen, to get your feedback on what you're all interested in and what you think might be helpful. At the next meeting, what we'd like to do is come back and present some more detailed research questions. And depending on what you all want to do, we could vote on whether you agree with the research questions and the focus that we're going to take, and or perhaps everybody's kind of in agreement and we know the steps we need to take next. So, sorry. Okay, so how will this research partnership work? Really, we'd like you to direct the focus of the research. So give us the topic areas that you are interested in knowing more about, and we will provide the research on that. We will direct the research. It means that we can figure out what data to get, we can figure out what methods to use, we can figure out how to define things with some feedback from you. But we really need to know kind of the broad issues that you're interested in. We are going to produce deliverables for you. That could be anything from short memos, research briefs, presentations. We have all worked with agencies before. We understand that maybe long reports are not conducive to this kind of partnership. We may produce some of those just to provide some level of detail, but we are going to focus on trying to give you pieces that are easy to digest and that you can use. And we would like some feedback on that as well. If something's not working, if what we're producing doesn't make sense to you, if it's not, useful in any way, we would like some feedback on it. So that's how we see this working. We are also going to work with we have already started working with your wonderful commission staff. Frankly, I think you know that your commission staff is stellar. They've already done a lot of the research that we need to kind of zero in on some of the areas that we think could use a little bit more research. So they're going to help us with data access. They're going to help us with definitions. They're going to use their institutional knowledge to kind of explain why things are the way they are in the data. So we've already introduced ourselves, but I just want to point out that and I think the only person that's not here on this list is Katie Sarkowitz, which is a legal research assistant for Kevin, that she'll be helping Kevin with some of the comparative and legal research. But I do just want to point out that we kind of have different skills and capabilities that we're bringing to this. Professor Kevin Wrights is obviously, you heard from him last time, he's bringing more of a comparative legal research skill set to this. He's worked a lot with other commissions in the past. He could provide a lot of information about what other commissions are doing, how they're wording their statutes, things like that. Both Professor Chris Eugen and Aaron are excellent with high-level quantitative methods, and they can talk a little bit more about that, but I think that's where they're going to be focusing their time, is working with that administrative data, looking at long looking at long-term trends, doing some projections in the future. What I would possibly like to bring to this, if you're all amenable to it, is a little bit more of a qualitative analysis component. I think research works best when you have a mixed methods approach. And I think sometimes the administrative data doesn't tell the whole picture. So I think it would be nice to do some research, maybe collecting some interview data, maybe just doing some analysis of, like judicial departure rates to provide more of an explanation of what we're seeing in the data, right? Okay, so this is a graph we did for a prior project. In fact, Kevin put this together, but we know, we just want to situate the Minnesota imprisonment and crime rate within a historical and cross-state context. But the blue line is Minnesota. The dotted red line is the rest of the country. So the rate in Minnesota, the prison rate peaked in 2015. It has been going down ever since, except for a slight uptick just in 2021 and 22 as kind of post-COVID, which actually happened across the board. It wasn't a huge uptick from what I understand, but there was an uptick. So in 2022, the Minnesota prison rate was 151 per 100,000. You had about 8,636 people in prison. And in 2022, Minnesota's prison rate was the 7th lowest among all states. From what I understand, you used to be kind of the 5th lowest, and now
Fourth or fifth.
Fourth or fifth, and now
Second or
you're
third.
so. And that has a lot to do with what other states are doing as well. There's been a lot of changes. A lot of states are decreasing the prison population. So I also just want to point out something that you probably already know, but maybe we could help provide more research on, is that the probation rate in Minnesota is quite high. In 2020, it was the 5th highest. There has been some research on what's been going on across the country and in Minnesota in particular. But as we know, there was a huge uptick in crime in the 1990s, and across the board, across all states, it's been declining, right? But the prison rate has not kept up with that trend. The prison rate has, there's been some relative stability. There has been a decrease overall, but generally it has not followed that huge decrease in the crime rate, right? So part of this, there's some research by Ryan King, who he was at Minnesota, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Was he your student?
Yes.
Yes.
And former research assistant.
Yeah, who looked at why this might be happening, why you have a relatively stable incarceration rate, imprisonment rate, and despite a declining crime rate. And there's actually been a rise in the average criminal history score, which you also know about, which is contributing to this. So I don't have a graph for this, but as you all know, there is continuing racial and ethnic disparities in imprisonment as well as sentencing in Minnesota. What is maybe a little bit unusual in Minnesota is that the Native American ethnic disparities are actually higher than the Black disparities, which is a little bit unusual for a state. So I think there's probably a lot of research to be done there. Particularly, we would be interested to see how policies affect those differences across time and within the state, within jurisdictions as well. So you have seen this chart before. Your staff has put it together. This is the actual and presumptive incarceration rates. We'd like to focus in on the bottom 2 lines. As you can see, the presumptive prison rate has slowly inched up, so more people are being recommended for prison sentences. And then that blue line on the bottom is who's actually going to prison, and that has inched down. And on its own, none of those are particularly extreme or interesting, but the fact that they're diverging, I think, is interesting. And there's, I think it could probably use a a little bit of research to figure out exactly why they're diverging, what's going on. And so we have, like I said, increasing presumptive prison rate, larger percentage of cases are being recommended for prison by the guidelines. And so one thing we could do is try to figure out why that's happening. And hopefully you can then use that information to make any sort of policy recommendations or changes to the guidelines that you see fit. So we would provide you with just extra information so that you're better informed. But it could be, and we've already identified this as a factor, is an increase in age of the average individual that's being sentenced for a felony, and the average criminal history score. So if you're young adults with lower criminal history scores are coming up for felony sentencing. It could be that there's a change in the composition of offenses that are being committed. So if serious crime could be up, it's just taking up a larger proportion of those sentences. There could just be revisions to the guidelines, particular offenses that are being sentenced as felonies as opposed to misdemeanors. It could be changes in prosecutorial practices. For example, prosecutors might be less inclined to plea bargain, or they're just seeking a higher severity of offenses for prosecution. So we can, it's usually never one thing. It's usually a combination of multiple things, and we can certainly try to examine which one of them, contributes more, contributes whatever part of to that trend line. So, okay. So just showing it to you again, we also know that there is a decrease in the executed prison rate. So at the same time as more people are being recommended for prison, a small percentage of people are going to state prison. And then so your staff has already identified that one reason is an increase in the mitigated dispositional departure rate. So a greater percentage of sentences are happening off the grid. I believe the number that I saw was 40% of executed prison recommendations have been departed from. And I think for specific offenses, it's actually even higher than that, well over 50%. I think, as Kevin talked about probably last time, right? Departures in and of themselves are not a bad thing. They're not indicative of the system not working. Although a very high departure rate for specific offenses, I think at the very least, is a call to take a closer look. Like, why are judges departing at such a high rate? Or at least more than half the time for some offenses. So one possibility, is that judges and prosecutors might be unsatisfied with how the guidelines are functioning, the statutory definition of specific crime, or a combination of both. It could be that there's been just general cohort shifts in sentencing philosophy, less of an emphasis on punitive or incarceration-based punishments, right? It could be that judges just feel more empowered to use their judicial discretion to take into individual case factors and sentence off the grid. It could be that judges are now interpreting the law in a different way, or the guidelines in a different way. And I'll just point out that, like, all three of those explanations you wouldn't be able to get from the administrative data necessarily. You'd be able to do that just through qualitative research, which we could provide. So it could be very basic resource constraints, economic factors of overcrowding in prisons, maybe not so much anymore, but certainly during COVID, I think that was an explanation. Could be an increase in the availability of non-prison sanctions, or changes in criminal behavior that are not in line with the statutory definition of the crime, which we often see as trends in criminal behavior change, particularly like new drugs and things like that. And for the most part, again, and as your staff has already identified, is that this is really may not be an issue across the board, but really an issue to specific offenses. So there are some issues with very specific offenses or categories of specific offenses where there is just misalignment between the guidelines and what the prosecutors and judges expect.
I'll jump in at this point. Yeah, I'm fine.
You're good.
Yeah, I often go off script.
Okay.
Apologies. But I really do want to, I appreciate the opportunity to work with the commission and I'm really reflecting, I'm really impressed with the challenge of your task. You know, that often as we're trying to apply the statistical methods to the data and questions that you're working with, your processes the changes that you make, they don't have an effect like a light switch, you know, that can turn things on and off, but it's much more like a hot stove or a cold stove or something. And we're trying to, then we'll come back in a half hour and see, well, what's the temperature, you know, and how did you set it at that point? And not only that, but there's like thousands or hundreds of ovens going on at once. And each year we have a list of new changes in the guidelines and practices. So I say that it just to be very appreciative and to approach you all with some real humility and wanting to listen to over the period of the next couple of years, not just today. I will just do a brief progress report. Yes, as Julie said, the staff in particular, Jill Payne and Leah Bauer have been terrific working just in the last month. And I'd say Nick has proceeded to begin doing some very basic data analysis on the Sentencing Project public use files over the last 10 years, which has enabled us to kind of extend analyses that have been done. And I say that only, this is kind of a landmark for us in any kind of project, is that it's like basically going from a car that you don't have keys for that's out there in the driveway to at least getting the engine to turn over, you know, and you feel like, okay, well, we're going to be able to deliver on these promises of delivering information. I'd also just say that the data are very clean. That's a credit to the Guidelines Commission. Nick, you said that unprompted to me. I think that's right, by social science standards. Now, the processes that you're analyzing are much more complex than many social science questions that people have. And so that will mean there'll be a lot of like complicated statistics at certain points. But I say that, you know, the commission has been excellent stewards of this information. And also making it transparent. So this question of average criminal history score over time, the reason that we are interested in this and focused on this is because it helps explain this big puzzle that Julia mentioned before about, well, we've had declining crime rates since 1995 in the state, and yet we've had relative stability in correctional population, prison populations, certainly. And so what we've noticed is that the average person coming in recent years has had a higher criminal history score. Well, I think everybody in the commission understands this and knows this. I won't belabor the point, but just to say that appears to be an important driver here, and is felt at the back end. You know, I just looked today, the average age of a person incarcerated in Minnesota prison is 39.6, which has increased over the past several decades. So there's a lot of possibilities for this, and we're going to be able to try to decompose some of these and look at their relative contribution. The average person coming into the system, average felony level defendant, has a record of committing more crime. There's also been changes, of course, in how the criminal history score is calculated. And we know the dates of those changes. We'll be able to kind of understand which were big things and which were comparatively little things, we think. But for example, felony DWI, we all know had a major impact on the system. There are other examples. There's also been some enhanced record keeping. And so as we get better, we track things a little more, we might have more complete data and more complete information. And this may have played a role. And then I just wanted to, I won't lecture because I know it's late and et cetera, but just to tease out a couple of different processes. One, that there's age in crime. And we know that Minnesota's population is getting older, and there is a defined age crime relationship. So people tend to commit more crime when they're 18 than when they're 40 or 59, as I am. And so we're seeing an increase in the average age. It also means that fewer youth are entering the system. Now, some of that is a demographic change, but some of that is just seems to be less law violation by younger cohorts. If we think in terms of generations, millennials, Gen Z are lower than Gen X or some of the late boomers. There's also these cohort-specific changes, as I was referencing, and this is where I hope the research can be useful. Is that one of our tasks is to read and make sense of literature from other jurisdictions, other states, other researchers, and there's some evidence that this more law-abiding cohort thing is actually happening in other places, like Chicago and Illinois, for example. And it may be that it's not that this cohort is exceptionally law-abiding. It could be that previous cohorts were somewhat more likely to be both committing crime and to be punished and apprehended for it. Then finally, the period effect that we're all aware of, and we look at those blips from 2020 to 2023, like that COVID was a major shock to our system. And so now we expect to see some of those incarceration, et cetera, rising perhaps as that backlog gets played through. The Great Recession was also something in an earlier period. If we look at 2009, 2010 numbers. Maybe we go to the next slide. So for all of these trends, we're going to be trying to figure out not only what's the general trend, but for whom it's happening. And I know that much on your mind is differences across districts, for example, and particularly we talked about those departure rates as varying quite a bit by district. And I hope it sounds like some of your listening sessions are going to get at some of that. And I think Julie is going to really be able to dig into that with some of the qualitative methodology she's proposing. Where it's happening and for whom it's happening. So let's move to the last one so that I'm not filibustering. So we have a list of some of the kind of questions and problems that we're working on. I'll just kind of briefly note, well, maybe Aaron, do you want to jump in at this point?
So I'll just say, like broadly, we can provide evidence to the commission on how sentencing guidelines, things that you're choosing, affect a broad range of outcomes, the sort of benefits and costs in the state broadly. So, there's been a lot of discussion and focus on things that are like pretty directly connected to the commission's purview. So how do the changes in the guidelines affect sentencing levels? How do they affect time served, other forms of supervision, and like disparities in these outcomes across groups? But those aren't the only important questions. We can also generate evidence for you and for the public on how changes in guidelines affect later outcomes outside supervision and correction, like individual recidivism, crime rates in particular communities, education, job training, employment, earnings among people convicted or sentenced under particular guidelines versus different guidelines, public costs of supervision. So we can give a fuller account. Like those are things that will be tough to deliver in 18 months or in 2 years, but we can lay a really strong foundation for those things, and we can, seek to extend the partnership in various ways potentially, or at least the research. We're all here in Minnesota. We're going to be working on these questions for a long time. So, and we can help give a fuller accounting of the impact of the guidelines on individuals' trajectories, on public safety, on the state's economy, and put you in a better position, a more informed position to pursue your objectives sort of effectively and efficiently in the future.
Yeah, so on that, a few things that we know we've heard from the commission before. We know folks are interested in isolating the effect of particular changes, things like the custody status point, for example, trying to isolate, well, how has that made a difference on particular outcomes? Also, looking at this criminal history score over the last 20 years, I think we can actually go back further than that. I'm confident. It gets a little messier as we get farther back. But to identify which components of criminal history have had the greatest impact on overall change. Then we can also decompose some of these differences across groups or areas across time. And I've got some citations there just to note that our first approach is not to try to reinvent the wheel here in terms of how to do some of these techniques. We can look at, okay, what are other people doing in using guidelines in the federal system in particular, but also in other states. And so we've seen, so part of what we can do is, and we're kind of compiling bibliographies as we go, both on the law, but also on some of these quantitative and qualitative data analyses. We can also do some mixed methods analysis of judges' written justifications for departure. Didn't know if justifications was the right word, but and so Julie has mentioned some of those. I just mentioned a couple of things of the data that make it both challenging and exciting to work with. One is that disposition and duration are separate processes that have to be understood in combination. That is, so if we're just looking at prison length or et cetera, and we're not adjusting statistically for who is eligible for that creates a challenge. And so we'll be kind of, some of the models will have those two layers or two-step processes. Another issue is that in many ways, the analysis is deterministic because the grid functions pretty well. And so stepping back, from the big picture, that most people are following the guidelines most of the time. And so often what we're analyzing is the residual of what's going off the grid, right? And so that's if now there's other steps we can do to say, well, okay, what if we replayed the scenario, replayed 2023 with 2010 rules, and see what would the outcomes look like? We think of it as kind of a rough counterfactual analysis, or an analysis that says, okay, well, what if we, just as you look at what would be the impact of this particular change, we can do some of that reconstructively. But as I say, I mean, we're here to listen and to ask questions, and we can give you a sense for feasibility and timeline. I mean, so some of the things that Aaron mentioned might take some time and focus, but we can often provide, an overview of the known knowns and the known unknowns, et cetera, that might be helpful to you, and hopefully serve the commission in its core mission. That's me.
Okay, so I don't have another slide after this. I was hoping to hear from all of you. We'd like to take the temperature of the room. I mean, what do you see us being most helpful with? What topics are you interested in?
Any comments, commission members? Commissioner Morath.
I feel like we often hear the term public safety thrown around, and I think, well, I know that's top priority for the commission. But I guess I would really like to see what is the current state with best way to quantify something as broad as public safety. I think that'd be really important.
So you started with an easy one.
Totally.
And I believe I heard Commissioner Crutchfield mention the public safety as well in the earlier portion of the meeting today, that You know, so there are some things we can do internally with these data. We were talking through a bit of that yesterday, actually, about, and then there's something that we can do. So, you know, return to the system within the Sentencing Guidelines Commission data. We can also do some things that involve matching and merging with State Court Administrator's Office data. That's a little more complex and a little more time consuming. And then there's some other things that would require meetings, you know, or things with other agencies, et cetera, to do. But I do think we'll be able to get a sense for maybe rates of return by cohort over time. I mean, would that sort of thing be helpful if we had like a 3-year window, a 5-year, a 10-year window?
And to that point, are we looking at collateral consequences? Are we overdosing some people? So we think we're doing a good job by giving them 72 months, but what we're really doing is we're saddling them to possibly reoffend with the collateral consequences. So really kind of the link between length of incarceration and reoffense and recidivism. And while I had the floor, I cut my teeth in a community corrections act county where we do have high probation. Are we getting what we're paying for? Is high probation a good idea, or is that just what do you call it, quicksand pulling people back in?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yes, and I know that I should. Or no, Commissioner Ladd.
So I probably have a big sort of thought on this, and I don't even know if it can be quantified, but I'm going to say it anyways, because I think what we hear a lot about is we hear numbers. And to me, the numbers are just that, and you have to go back several layers to sort of understand that. So for example, my experience is that people don't go to prison right out of the gate, even on presumptive sentences, for whatever reason. So if we're trying to figure out like what people are doing and why they're doing it, and then narrowing that down and looking at those kinds of offenses to try to understand all that. And to Commissioner Crutchfield's point is like, you know, are our resources on the community-based side of things being resourced appropriately or not, what have you. So here's my question. So if we talk about somebody getting committed to the Department of Corrections, not initially, whether it's departed or it's presumptive stay, but eventually they go, how many people are sitting in prison that way versus somebody who goes to prison right out of the gate? That's an interesting thing to me. So, because if somebody has 4, 5, 6, 7 probation violations and they're ultimately executing a sentence, I think that leaves some questions in terms of resources about what's happening on the community-based side or not. And again, sort of sentencing philosophies geographically about the kinds of offenses that maybe judges or prosecutors and defense attorneys are agreeing to do departures on. And then probation fails and they ultimately execute. Because I think when we hear somebody going to prison, and this is how many people we have in prison, somebody doesn't go to prison for 60 months right away. They might do it on the installment plan, and by the time they go, they're sitting in prison for 6 or 7 months because they've already done some of that. So that's an interesting thing to me. So as I think about that, I think about the general data, about the population numbers, about people that get committed right out of the gate versus people who go as a result of a revocation process. And those revocation processes could be multiple times before they actually go. And then within those two groups, what are those offenses that we're seeing those sort of kind of flush out? I think that would be interesting. I also am interested in understanding in 2016 when the drug law reforms came into play and we had the drug law grid that came into play and the thresholds for drugs went up and the consequences for sentences essentially went down. So essentially you had to commit a first-degree drug sale for it to be a presumptive commit. Everything else was a presumptive stay. That was a big change. Mm-hmm. And so it's a big change in terms of a shift to probation for all of those offenses, because some of those offenses were prison offenses initially, even for people who had no criminal history score. So I think that 2016 mark related to our drug offenses is an interesting sort of data point, but I am interested in understanding sort of the people that are serving sentences, if they're actually serving them as a result of revocation proceedings, whether they got a departure or not, versus if they're serving a sentence because they were committed to the Department of Corrections upon the initial sentence. And I think then looking at what are those offenses. I mean, I just, to me, that's an interesting thing. And I think it kind of gets to sort of why are we maybe the severity levels are, I mean, again, looking at those different things. And if we can isolate that, it might lead us down other paths to ask more questions or to give us some understanding about some of these sentencing data that we're seeing, not just a number of how many people are in prison.
I think I'm hearing two really important kind of research hooks here that are obviously related, but one is this, how people reach prison. And and I believe these data are available to us within the data set that we have. And so I think we'll be able to at least, give some basic descriptive information about that fairly quickly. The other one is about the drug law shifts in 2016, which I think, I thought some penalties increased, some decreased, et cetera, but so it's not like a simple treatment, but it's a treatment that we should be able to identify.
Commissioner,
I don't want to be over, I don't want a research meeting to break out,
Commissioner Ladd, building on what you said, the person who gets revoked, they're committing crimes. I mean, they're affecting public safety and they are affecting public viewpoints on sentencing guidelines. They're taking up law enforcement resources, all the different collateral things that go along with what you're saying.
Commissioner Mueller.
If you're just looking for feedback for me, I'm new to the commission. So just generally speaking, one, I want to know if these are working. And if they're not, what steps can we take? I mean, I know that's broad, so it's more of maybe a little bit of a statement, but two things that kind of come to mind. How you mentioned departures, how does that affect public safety? How does that affect, I don't know enough about that. And, the judges on the panel can speak more to that and the attorneys. But that's a new concept to me, and I just don't know enough about that. So the departure piece. And secondly, I think to what Commissioner Ladd's speaking to, what I see, you're correct, Commissioner Crutchfield, in terms of there may be committing crimes, but this is maybe beyond our purview. But how does, some of these are just substance use violations, and how does substance use disorder, mental health, how do those things come into play? Because maybe they're not crimes, but it's a use revocation or something along those lines. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention those two things and how that might affect the incarceration rate. And I know judges, as part of sentencing, will maybe send someone to a rehabilitation program maybe prior to service or to executing their sentence. So I'm just kind of those things. That's what we see all the time in law enforcement. Are those two issues, which are a huge portion of the crimes we deal with. So I don't know, I might be broadening this a little bit too much, but those two pieces, mental health and substance use disorder, are significant for me.
And my sense is we would have better data on the on substance use crimes, and I'm not sure we have reasons for revocation coded. But yeah, maybe. So that's a topic, but I think that and all of these also are moving targets. I mean, so in terms of how people are treated in the system or what gets revoked, et cetera. But I think that's also a place where probably talking with some people who are in the field now, and how they make decisions would also be really informative.
I could just add to, I think like you're touching on specific examples of something that's very important, is that the way the guidelines function depend on a lot of other, how they interact with it, a lot of other issues and policies and institutions in the community. And so like being aware of that context in how much substance abuse resources are available, or substance abuse treatment resources are available, how much capacity is in the prisons, like all of these things are gonna change how the decisions you make as a guideline commission, and the guidelines that you recommend are put in place, like how that translates into reality for people on the ground. So it's a great thing for us to keep in mind.
If I could put my 2 cents in, I would say all of the above, because these have been like amazing discussions. I'm really excited by these and maybe you can't do it all, but try. But then I just want to call out again that the point that Julia made earlier, we do have a few offenses where the departure rate is over 50%. There's one offense on our books where both dispositional and durational departure rates are up there for that one offense. So strong signals from the system that there is something wrong there. And I would, I think we would be remiss if we did not figure those things out before we got to the end of this review. So I feel like we need to also spend a little time looking at those specific offenses. I do think there's a role for the commission staff to do some of this work and a role for you all to do some of this work. And I hope there's going to be a good collaboration and figuring out who can take which pieces. But I just wanted to call that out as well. Commissioner Larkin.
Thank you. I don't know that this is a research topic, but one thing that interests me is what works in terms of rehabilitation for folks. And based on my experience as a public defender and then as a district court judge, I always felt, and actually as a juvenile court lawyer too, working with kids, it always seemed to me, and this isn't research based or anything else, but it just always seemed to me from a practical perspective that when we took the folks who had demonstrated over and over that they're not going to be able to pull it together on probation because they have chemical problems and mental health problems, so they don't have the support they need in the community. If we were put those folks, kids or adults, in some sort of placement for a year, and for kids it could be a true placement, for adults it might be like a year at the workhouse with attendant services. I always felt like we had success with those people because we removed them from the community, we kept them out of prison, and we put them in a place where it was easier for them to maintain contact with their family, and they could, get the services delivered to them. So I don't know if there's any way to research whether what I've just observed anecdotally works. And if there is, maybe that's whether something we should do, because my concern based on my history in the system is we so often have this all or nothing. Your community-based services, we end up on the installment plan, and then finally you get revoked and go to prison, as Commissioner Ladd said, for a short period of time. That doesn't do anybody any good. Is there a way to look at ways to intervene, to get people the help they need by taking them out of the community without sending them to prison at the end of a very long, unsuccessful probation period? I don't know if there's a way to look at that. I don't know how the research would affect that, but that's one thing that's of interest to me because I have seen it work with people that no one thought it would work with, but just getting people sober for a long enough period of time and getting them then to the resources seemed to be a successful approach.
My first reaction on that is that there is an opportunity to look at particular offense categories for which one can get a 1-year sentence of incarceration or a longer probation term, and try to find like groups to compare kind of outcomes under different scenarios. The challenge, of course, is that judges are often wise and so don't make their determinations randomly. And so we have to try to get the groups as equivalent as we can to see kind of those outcomes. But there are ways to look, and particularly if we drill down to particular types of charges, et cetera, where we can get maybe an apple to orange comparison instead of like an apple to chainsaw comparison.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think it's super helpful for you to articulate what you're interested in, and then let us think about like research methods to try to tackle and generate evidence. So I can't promise we can deliver, but I promise we'll think hard about it and try to learn more that might give us leverage on that. And I think the more that we can learn about like what shifts the probability of somebody getting those things. So over time, if there's changes in policies that make some of these things more accessible or less accessible, those are the kinds of things we can use. And so we can dig in. If you tell us this seems really promising, we can try to learn more about the context that can give us leverage.
And if I could tag on to that, Commissioner Larkin, what you're articulating there are policy choices that, could potentially be made. And there are other guideline systems that have more than a binary choice on their grids. And so this is where Kevin comes in because we could also look at ways that other commissions have thought about different types of dispositions. And I know there's research on these kinds of ideas in like North Carolina. I'm pretty sure has that sort of short-term stay kind of concept. So there's probably, if we threw out an idea, then I think people could probably track down like, well, has it been done before? Is there any research that relates to it where it has been done? So I'm just putting tasks on your list, but there's other options, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Professor.
I've been thinking since last meeting, what subjects might be of importance to the state that we haven't put on our own plate, or and one that I wonder about is jail incarceration rates. When you look at almost any country, when they compute their incarceration rate, they don't make a distinction between prisons and jails. So European statistics are all effectively a combination of the two would be in the United States. And jail incarceration rates in Minnesota are really interesting, or have been really interesting over the life of the guidelines. In the first 15 years or so under the life of guidelines, there were more, on any given day, there were more people in jail in Minnesota than there were in prison. And most of those were sentenced prisoners who they'd been convicted and were serving as a condition of probation over. And then that changed very dramatically, where the number of sentenced people in jail began to fall and the pretrial detention went up, so that the sort of sentenced percentage in jail populations really changed dramatically, kind of, approaching the halfway point of when the guidelines came in to where they are today, or something like that. And I've always wondered, under the Minnesota system, are we doing a good job at looking at long-term change if we only look at prison rates and don't sort of add in what seems to be a pretty changeable jail incarceration rate, some of which is detention, which isn't sentencing. But there have been really big changes in the number of convicted people who are in jail on any given day. And I just found myself wondering over the last month, should the commission be ignoring that? Should researchers be ignoring that, or is that part of the whole that we should be looking at?
To pick up on that with that metaphor I used about the stove warming up and cooling down, the jail is more like the microwave. I mean, that is like, it pops really quickly. I mean, so peak jail here was like 93 so that and other increases in the early 2000s, but it's I think that is part of the total picture, and I'm sure that other system actors are attentive to that. But it's a great point, Kevin.
Great. Yes, Commissioner Milbrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things that I think that I'm quite interested in is the the criminal history score and that it's been increasing, and if there's certain parts of that that can be identified. And one thing that we keep getting so much feedback is everyone wants these guidelines to be simplified. And it seems like a lot of the provisions for determining criminal history score, where there's a lot of complications, a lot of extra looking into different things like, where there's multiple sentencings on one day, the Hernandez method, the enhanced felonies, and how the targeted misdemeanors are then added in. So there's some of those points where I think it would be helpful to see if there's things that we can look at on criminal history and identify them to maybe work on some of those calculations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much. And I think we will need to draw on the wisdom of to try to fully understand that. I know we have Commissioner Fraze is a national expert in thinking about some of these issues, and not to call you sir, but that is the case.
All right, any other feedback for our researchers?
You have one online.
There's one online, okay, yeah, Commissioner Knudsen.
I definitely think we need to take a look at jail. I mean, just in my career, I mean, if you were stopped for driving after revocation, you went to jail. There were consequences. I can't remember anyone recently going to jail for driving after revocation. So you talk about our ultimate penalty, which is loss of liberty. And it happens with the jail sentence and it happens with the prison sentence. And so what's the correlation? What's happening when the jail sentences go down and the prison sentences go up? Or if that's even happening, I don't know. But I think Professor Reitz is exactly right. We have to take a look at that to really understand what's happening within our system as a whole.
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, it's okay. I'm looking for the online and you're right. Commissioner Morath.
No, just with the jail thing, I think it's also an opportunity, thinking about these other systems that are so deeply intertwined. Also, just what's going on with mental health facilities and detox facilities, where jail becomes the only option a lot of the time. So it's not necessarily, the more traditional routes, but are certainly having an impact.
Yeah, some of those, I do have some limited data on a particular cohort, but we mapped the path from prison to the workhouse, to drug treatment, to chemical health treatment, or to mental health treatment. And there are, if you put all these institutions on a diagram, there are paths between all of them, but some of these paths are really heavy. Like in locally, many people end up in the workhouse, regardless of the other institutional contacts that they've had. That's a little outside the project, but if there's interest in those kind of multi-system involvement, we have some limited data on that for Minnesota.
Yeah, I think the rub for us is that that multi-system involvement affects how we might establish the rules around sentencing. And so, as an example, if you look at our grid, some of the lower level drug property crimes, you have to commit a lot of them to go to prison. So it's a philosophy about, well, that's not the type of crime that should get you to prison, but it's also a recognition that substance abuse often drives those crimes, right? So that's probably, that's why it's down there. So it's like there is an interrelationship with how we then set policy. And I know you're not gonna be able to figure everything out, but I'm really glad that we're already thinking about those things, because we do have to have those discussions along the way. Commissioner Lack?
Thank you. I don't want to belabor the point, but I do think back to the jail issue. I mean, I think just following up on what Chair Mitchell said, you've got to commit a lot of lower level drug offenses, for example, to get to prison, but you also have to commit a lot of probation violations once you get there to get that sentence, right? And I think the other thing that comes into play with our jail populations, again, I've got somebody who's got over 700 days of credit. They're not sentenced yet, and they're looking at doing a 100-month sentence. That's a lot of jail credit. And it's not just in my county, but I mean, this person is doing things in multiple jurisdictions, right? But the other thing that plays into this jail population is the advent of all the treatment courts and specialty courts that we implemented in Minnesota. And I think currently there are 6 counties in the state that don't have that and don't utilize that. But those are, again, what we call intermediate sanctions and consequences, that you do something you're not supposed to do for the diversion in that treatment court, you get a couple days in jail. And again, installment plan stuff, trying to do all that stuff, that starts adding up on an aggregate basis for some of these folks. And again, some of those people do find themselves in prison, some of them don't. But ultimately, all we're seeing is a prison number. And again, how did they get there? I think the path there is really, to me, what I want to know about, because I think that then tells us not only from a sentencing practice and a guideline perspective, but if we want to actually have stakeholders invest money wisely to address these things, to address public safety, we have the information that tells us sort of the pressure points and what's happening and where it's happening. And so again, I think the jail question is relevant to all of this, because we are seeing people do sentences on installment plans. That's pretty common. And so I think we would be remiss in our duties if we didn't analyze that as part of the whole package here about prison populations, because ultimately the jails are a subset of that. And by the way, there was a period in time in Minnesota, I'm kind of getting historical here, but there was a period of time when somebody had less than 6 months to go at the Department of Corrections. They sent them back to the local jails to serve the remaining prison sentence at the local jail, right? There was a period of time that was doing that, and the Department of Corrections paid the local county jails for that housing. I'm assuming that was considered prison population at that time, even if they were being housed locally. But again, those kinds of things happen too. And so I do think that jail issue is connected to all of this, and it would be really important data for us to look at.
Commissioner Mueller?
Just briefly, I want to say ditto. Everything you just said, spot on, and things that I'm interested in as well. And ultimately, I think the public can't decipher between jail and prison. They don't understand. They're talking about incarcerated friends, family, etc. And that's so I really appreciate you bringing this up. That's very important to me as well.
I should say about prison on the installment plan, we really ran into that issue in the previous project that we worked on, where we were trying to estimate how much time people were actually serving on the sentences that were imposed or on their maximum sentence across the country in as many states as we could. And what we could never add into our understanding was how much credit for pretrial detention are they bringing forward upon admission to prison. Because if they're bringing a lot, then that's part of the sentence that was already served, and in some sense should count towards the sentence length, and yet we don't have a good way of tracking that.
Well, our sentencing orders would obviously tell us that, because when someone gets committed, they have their jail credit that's applied that way. But again, they're big numbers, and I think it's something that's real, because we do have a lot of cases. And I really am interested, and I can't say this enough, I'm really interested in knowing how many people go to prison out of the gate, because that is just not a practical experience that I see a lot where I'm at in the part of the state I'm in. You have to really work hard to go to prison. But we do a lot of installment stuff, and the problem with that is there's no treatment programming that's happening in that process. So when somebody actually ends up going to prison, what we hear is there's not enough time to do programming in the prison sentence, because they don't have enough time left on their sentence to get DOC programming. So they're basically just going to sit, which doesn't really solve and address the public safety issue, because they're coming back out very shortly. And that's another important piece of this, is that if they go to prison, there's programming available, but not for short amounts of time. There isn't.
All right. Do you have enough?
We're sorry they asked.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm wondering what the legislature will do in the next year, whether there'll be any changes. We suddenly have a unified jail prison system. Or a court ruling that's
Will be
results.
Rhode Island or Connecticut.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
All right, well, anything else that you need to cover today, or does that bring us to the end?
No, I think we can come back. We'll regroup. I think we have a couple meetings coming up in the next few days. We can probably rewatch this. But yeah, I mean, I think everything you covered are, I mean, these are fundamental questions. You're trying to figure out what works best for which people. You want to be able to identify the people and match them up with the sanction that's going to give you the best outcomes. And we're on board with that. We're going to be able to help you with that. And then hopefully there can be some synergy between the choices that you're going to make and the policy recommendations that you're going to make and the information we can provide for you. So I'm excited about this partnership. I'm looking forward to coming back, and I'm looking forward to our next research meeting where we can go through our list of, I think I have 13 ideas so far, so we can narrow it.
Should we give you 14 so it's not unlucky?
Sure.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming today, and thank you to the commission for really having a great engaged conversation. That was wonderful. Okay, let's see, I have to find my agenda again. Here we go. The next item on the agenda is the Administrative Rules Subcommittee report. So is that Commissioner Knudsen?
Yes, the Administrative Rules Subcommittee consisting of Commissioner Moran and Commissioner Middlebrook and myself met with the assistance, of course, of our Executive Director, Nate Wrights, and his staff to review again the rules that we need to change to streamline our ability to respond to the legislative action following a session and the effective dates of their new criminal laws. So we have to line up our schedule and our calendar with public hearings in order to change and modify and make recommendations to the legislature on any changes to the guidelines. But before we can even do that, we also have to look at the rules that allow us to change our rules. And so we've,
Of course.
we spent time looking at the source of all of our administrative rules and then what rules govern the changing of each of those sets of rules. So we met January 23rd, and we've got another meeting coming up on March 26th, and we will are looking to make recommendations eventually to the commission after we kind of sort through what how to streamline this and to make it work for the legislative I guess, how would I describe it? Uncertainties in their effective date of the criminal laws and in their completion of their work after each session. So that's where we're at.
All right, any questions from commission members? All right, thank you so much for diving in. I can only imagine how exciting reading about how to change rules has been. We're looking forward to hearing back from you. Thank you. Okay, and then moving on to the Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin my report, it looks like everybody online, the members of the public, are all joining us via computer or mobile phone, so you should be able to raise your hand if you would like to make a statement to the commission in the next agenda item, which is public input. So in the interest of time, if you could please raise your hands now while I'm speaking, that would be great, so that we'd be able to move right into any public input that anyone has. So the first item on my Executive Director's report has to do with the report to the legislature, which you adopted at the last meeting. Shortly after publication of that document, somebody from the media brought to our attention that some of the numbers in figure 15 did not match up with the text that described figure 15. And we identified that there was an error in figure 15. So as part of your meeting materials, I've provided pages 28 and 29 of the report to the legislature as corrected. All the changes were made on page 29, but 28 just gives you some context. And all the changes were made to figure 15 and then in the footnote at the bottom. But just wanted to alert you to the fact that the report to the legislature was in a slightly different form than the one that we gave to the legislature on time, but it didn't affect any of the statutory responsibilities of reporting by the 15th, even though the corrections were not submitted. The second thing I wanted to report has to do with the legislative preview. The legislative session is starting next week. I did go to a legislative preview last week. I'm going to another one tonight. The big issue is money. As always, the February budget forecast is scheduled to come out in March, and I think that's going to drive a lot of what happens in the legislature. On the House side, there does appear to be some willingness to work on the commission's 5 of the 7 recommendations that the commission made to the legislature, so that's exciting. On the Senate side, I didn't hear a lot of specificity other than 2 things from Chairman Ron Latz, the senator who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee. One was an interest in looking at the crime of fleeing a peace officer in a motor vehicle, which we see a lot of, possibly creating more variations in that, maybe restoring the gross misdemeanor level and adding some more severe sentencing levels for felonies. So stay tuned on that. But he also talked about the comprehensive review, and he said he didn't think that anything would be ready this year, but maybe next year or something. Now, I want to just say, we never appeared in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee to make our pitch for funding for the comprehensive review, which is interesting to me. But it sounds like we may need to do some expectation setting if and when we do appear in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee next, because it's clearly not something that's going to happen in this biennium. And just a footnote on both money and this biennium. I was really excited to hear from the University of Minnesota team. One thing, the most important thing that they said from my bureaucratic mindset was in the beginning when they talked about 2025. So their money is running out in 2025. And there's and the same thing is true for the MAD public engagement side. They're running out in the middle of 2025 and the research money is running out at the end of 2025. So my thought is there's no guarantee there's going to be any money for any part 2 of this. It may just be with existing resources. So my suggestion is ride these people hard while we have the money.
You mean that in the nicest
I mean
way.
it in the nicest sense of the word, and I see what they're over. So that's really it for the legislative preview. The third thing I had is the demographic impact statement policy, which is in your materials. And those of you who've been on the commission before may recall that you have an opportunity, if you wish, you don't have to do this, but if you want to be involved in the process of creating demographic impact statements, you can ask to be involved in that process, and then you'll have a chance to review demographic impact statements before they're submitted to the legislature. It does slow down the process a little bit, so don't feel like you have to do that. You can get them after the fact as well, but that is an option that's available to you under your demographic impact statement policy. The other thing I wanted to just point out is we are still engaged in the hiring process. I don't have an update for you at this point, but some really exciting things that I hope to be able to report to you in the March meeting regarding hiring, including possibly filling a dedicated research position to basically focus on the comprehensive review and hopefully work closely with the University of Minnesota research team. But that's all to be determined, and hopefully we'll have an exciting report for you in March. So that concludes my report, Madam Chair.
All right. So that's the end of your reports. Then we move on to public input. So I should have asked, were there any questions that any commission members had update before we move to public input? Okay. Hearing none, we can move on to public input.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if any members of the public do want to make a statement, please raise your hands on your WebEx applications that you're all accessing the meeting to. Again, it doesn't appear that anybody is accessing by just a plain old telephone number, so you should all be able to raise your hand on the application that you're accessing this meeting by. Madam Chair, I don't see any hands raised.
I don't either. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the agenda for today. I just want to thank the commission members again for a really good engaged discussion. I think that this discussion today will set up our auxiliary teams for beginning that stakeholder input process and the research process. And I really appreciate all the time and thoughtfulness that went into the conversations today. I'm excited. Like every time we have these discussions, I'm excited. And today was one of the the most you've talked. So I'm really excited now. And I can't wait to see where we go. With that, unless there's any objection, the meeting is adjourned.